Keep your blood money." Vincent Caruso stood frozen in the doorway of the small Brooklyn bookstore, the Cartier bracelet still clutched in his hand. The woman behind the counter didn't even glance up from her inventory list. Her dark hair cascaded over her shoulders in waves, and her fingers moved methodically across the page, completely indifferent to the $10,000 piece of jewelry glittering in the afternoon sunlight streaming through the window. Vincent Caruso owned half of New York. From the docks in Red Hook to the construction sites towering over Manhattan, his name carried weight that made grown men's knees buckle and their voices shake. At 42, he'd built an empire that would have made his father proud, controlled territory that stretched across 3 boroughs and commanded respect from people who'd never even seen his face. Women threw themselves at him at every opportunity. Business owners literally begged for his attention and protection. Politicians answered his calls on the first ring, their voices eager and obsequious. If you're enjoying this story, please subscribe and leave a comment letting us know where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. Now let's continue with the story, but this woman, this bookstore owner with her worn jeans, simple white t-shirt and ink-stained fingers, had just dismissed him like he was absolutely nobody. Like he was some street vendor trying to sell her cheap watches. The rejection burned in his chest, unfamiliar and deeply infuriating in a way he couldn't quite articulate. "I don't think you heard me correctly," Vincent said, his voice low and controlled in the way that usually made people nervous. He placed the bracelet on the counter between them with deliberate care, pushing it closer to her with 2 fingers. "This is a gift. A genuine apology for my men causing trouble outside your shop last week." Finally, she looked up. Her eyes were green, impossibly sharp, and completely, utterly unimpressed. "I heard you fine, Mr. Caruso, and I'm telling you no. I don't want your apology, and I certainly don't want your jewelry. What I want is for you and your people to find somewhere else to conduct your business. This is a quiet neighborhood. We'd like to keep it that way." Her name was Elena Russo, and she'd owned Between the Pages for 3 years. Vincent had done his research thoroughly after his men had used the street outside her shop for a collection meeting that had gotten embarrassingly loud. He knew she was 28 years old, that she'd inherited the store from her grandmother who'd passed away suddenly, that she lived in the modest apartment above the shop, and that she had no husband, no boyfriend, no family in the city besides a younger brother named Michael, who taught high school English in Queens. What his extensive research hadn't told him was that she would be beautiful in a way that had absolutely nothing to do with expensive makeup or designer clothes. Or that she would look at him like he was simply a problem to be efficiently solved, rather than a dangerous man to be feared and respected. "Everyone has a price," Vincent said, leaning against the counter with practiced ease. "Name yours." Elena set down her pen with a sharp click and crossed her arms defensively across her chest. "You're not listening to me. I don't want your money. I don't want anything from you or your world. I just want you to leave my store and leave me alone. That bracelet is worth more than this entire store and probably everything in it. Then give it to someone who actually cares about things like that." She picked up the jewelry box firmly and held it out to him with steady hands. "Please go. I have work to do." Vincent stared at her, something completely unfamiliar stirring in his chest. In his world, literally everything was a transaction. Loyalty was bought with money and favors, silence was paid for in cash or threats, and problems were solved with either large amounts of money or carefully applied force. This woman was refusing both options, and he genuinely had no idea how to respond to that. "You're making a serious mistake," he said quietly, his voice carrying just a hint of warning. "No," Eleanor replied, meeting his eyes without even the slightest flinch. "I'm making a choice. There's a significant difference between those two things." Vincent took the box slowly, his fingers deliberately brushing against hers for just a split second. He saw her jaw tighten almost imperceptibly, saw the way she pulled her hand back quickly, and he smiled knowingly, so she wasn't quite as unaffected as she was, so determinedly pretending to be. "I'll be back," he said with certainty. "Please don't," she replied firmly. But as he walked out of the bookstore and into the waiting black SUV, where his driver and personal bodyguard, Marcus, sat alert and ready, Vincent knew with absolute certainty that he would be back. Not because he was angry, though his considerable pride was definitely wounded, and not because he wanted to intimidate her, though he could have done that easily enough with a single phone call. He would be back because Elena Russo had done something that no one had managed to do in 20 years. She'd made him genuinely curious about another human being. "How did it go, boss?" Marcus asked, as they pulled smoothly away from the curb. Vincent looked at the expensive bracelet in his hand, then back at the bookstore through the tinted window. Through the glass, he could see Elena already back at work, completely unconcerned with what had just transpired between them. "She said no," Vincent said simply. Marcus's eyes widened visibly in the rearview mirror. "She what?" "You heard me correctly. What do you want to do about it? Should I send some guys to have a conversation with her?" Vincent was quiet for a long moment, watching the familiar Brooklyn streets pass by outside his window. In his world, rejection automatically meant disrespect. Disrespect meant consequences, usually swift and painful. But something about this particular situation felt fundamentally different. Elena hadn't rejected him out of calculated fear or strategic calculation. She'd rejected him because she genuinely, honestly didn't want what he was offering. The simple honesty of it was almost refreshing in his world of constant lies and manipulation. "Find out everything about her," Vincent finally said decisively. "Her daily routine, her friends, where she gets her morning coffee, what books she reads, what she does on weekends, everything. You thinking of applying pressure to change her mind? I'm thinking of understanding why someone would say no to me. That's rare enough to be interesting." That evening, Vincent sat alone in his luxurious penthouse overlooking Central Park, a glass of expensive whiskey in his hand, and tried to remember the last time someone had genuinely surprised him. His life was predictable in its constant unpredictability. There were always new threats to neutralize, important deals to close, territories to defend against encroachment, but it all followed certain established rules, certain recognizable patterns. Everyone either wanted something from him or they wanted to take something from him. Elena Russo wanted neither, and that simple fact was fascinating. His phone buzzed with a text message from his underboss, Tony. "Problem with the Castellano shipment. Need you at the warehouse immediately." Vincent typed back a quick response and stood up, draining his glass in one smooth motion. Business always came first. That was the fundamental rule he'd lived by religiously since taking over from his father 15 years ago. The rule that had kept him alive and powerful in a world where both were constantly under serious threat from multiple directions. But as he grabbed his jacket and headed for the door, he found himself thinking about green eyes and ink-stained fingers, about a woman who'd looked at him like he was completely ordinary, like he was just another man she could dismiss with a few carefully chosen words and a steady, unflinching gaze. Vincent Caruso had built his entire empire on the fundamental principle that everyone had a price. But Elena Russo had just proven him spectacularly wrong, and that simple fact was potentially more dangerous than any rival family could ever be, because it meant there were rules he didn't fully understand, games he hadn't learned to play yet. And Vincent Caruso always learned the game eventually, no matter what it took, no matter how long it required. The next morning, Elena opened her bookstore at exactly 9 o'clock, just like she did every single day. She'd barely slept, constantly replaying the encounter with Vincent Caruso in her mind throughout the long night. She knew who he was, of course. Everyone in this particular part of Brooklyn knew the Caruso name intimately. You couldn't live and work here for 3 years and not know. You couldn't read the newspapers or watch the local news without seeing references to the family and their extensive operations. What had surprised her most was how unexpectedly normal he'd seemed in person. She'd expected someone more obviously dangerous, more theatrical and menacing in his presentation, but Vincent Caruso had been quiet, controlled, almost polite in his casual arrogance, and somehow that made him infinitely more dangerous, not less. Her best friend Sarah arrived at 10 with coffee and fresh croissants from the bakery down the street. "You look absolutely terrible," Sarah said bluntly, setting the cups down on the counter. "What's wrong? Did something happen?" Elena debated internally whether to tell her about yesterday's unexpected visit. Sarah was a corporate lawyer, practical and razor-sharp. But she also worried obsessively about everything, especially about Elena's safety in this neighborhood. "Nothing serious, just didn't sleep well last night." "You're lying. I can always tell." Sarah studied her face carefully. "What happened?" Before Elena could formulate an answer, the door chimed cheerfully, and a professional delivery man walked in, carrying an enormous bouquet of white roses. There must have been at least 50 perfect stems, elegantly arranged in a crystal vase that probably cost as much as the flowers themselves. "Delivery for Elena Russo," the man said with a bright smile. Elena's stomach sank with dread. "I didn't order any flowers. They're from a Vincent Caruso. There's a card included." Sarah's eyes went dramatically wide. "As in Vincent Caruso? The Vincent Caruso, the one who runs half of Brooklyn?" Elena took the heavy vase with slightly shaking hands and set it carefully on the counter. The card was simple but clearly expensive. She opened it slowly and read the single line written in elegant script. "Everyone deserves beautiful things, even those who stubbornly refuse them. V." "Oh my God," Sarah breathed, leaning over to read the card. "Why is Vincent Caruso sending you expensive flowers?" "Because I apparently made a terrible mistake yesterday," Elena said quietly. "What kind of mistake exactly?" "The kind where I told a powerful Mafia boss no to his face, twice." Over the next week, the gifts kept arriving with clockwork regularity. Rare first-edition books that Elena knew cost thousands of dollars. Elegant jewelry that she immediately returned. Flowers in every color imaginable. Each gift came with a simple card bearing Vincent's distinctive handwriting. Elena refused every single one, sending them all back untouched. But that only seemed to make him more persistent and determined. He started appearing at her bookstore personally, always during quiet afternoon hours when there were few customers around. Always polite, always respectful, never pushing too hard or making threats. He would browse the shelves, occasionally purchase a book, and attempt to engage her in conversation about literature or the neighborhood or anything except his obvious interest in her. "Why won't you accept anything from me?" he asked one particularly quiet Thursday afternoon. "Because accepting gifts means owing favors, and I absolutely will not owe someone like you anything." "Someone like me?" Vincent raised an eyebrow. "Someone who solves problems primarily with violence and money." Elena met his eyes directly. "I've seen what happens to people who get close to men like you, Mr. Caruso. They get hurt. They get killed. They lose themselves completely. I'm not interested in that life." Vincent was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes studying her face intently. "You're right about my world being dangerous, but I'm offering you protection and respect, not a cage to live in. In my experience, there's really no meaningful difference between those two things." But even as she said the words firmly, Elena felt something fundamental shifting inside her. Vincent wasn't at all what she'd expected or feared. He was surprisingly quiet, carefully controlled, and unexpectedly thoughtful in their conversations. He asked intelligent questions about the books she recommended. He remembered small details from their previous conversations. And the way he looked at her made her feel genuinely seen in a way she hadn't experienced in years. It terrified her completely. Then everything changed drastically in a single violent evening. Elena was closing the store alone one evening around 8 o'clock when 3 large men wearing dark masks suddenly forced their way inside through the front door. They carried baseball bats and moved with obvious purpose and coordination. Within minutes, they had systematically destroyed everything she'd built. Shelves were violently overturned, books were deliberately torn and scattered across the floor like confetti. Her grandmother's precious antique reading lamps were smashed into pieces. The children's corner where she hosted Saturday story time was completely demolished, the colourful cushions slashed open and the handmade puppet theatre broken into kindling. When one of the men roughly grabbed Elena's arm, she fought back instinctively, scratching and kicking. But a bat swung viciously toward her, and when she raised her hand defensively, it connected with crushing force. Glass from a nearby lamp exploded, cutting deep into her palm and wrist. Blood immediately began streaming down her arm. "This is what happens when you disrespect the Castellanos," the leader said coldly, before they calmly walked out, leaving her standing amid the ruins. Sarah found her an hour later, sitting on the floor surrounded by destruction, clutching her bleeding hand and sobbing quietly. She immediately called the number that Elena had reluctantly made her memorize weeks ago, just in case, Vincent's private number. He arrived at Methodist Hospital like an approaching storm, Marcus and 2 other intimidating men flanking him protectively. His face was set in hard lines that promised violence. Elena was in room 314, her hand professionally bandaged, her face pale and hollow with shock. "Are you hurt anywhere else?" Vincent demanded immediately, his hands moving to check her face, her arms, looking for other injuries. "Define hurt," Elena said, her voice completely hollow and distant. "My store is utterly destroyed. My grandmother's irreplaceable legacy is gone. Everything I worked for is ruined, and it's all because of you and your world." Vincent felt her words hit him like physical blows. "The Castellanos did this because of a business dispute with my family. Dante Castellano wanted to send me a message about territory. And I was the convenient message." Tears filled her eyes and spilled down her cheeks. "I said no to you specifically, to avoid this exact situation, but it didn't matter at all, did it? Saying no made me a target just as much as saying yes would have." Vincent felt the brutal truth of her words cut deep, because she was absolutely right. "I'll make this right. I'll rebuild your store better than before, and the men who did this will pay severely for touching you. That doesn't make me safe going forward." Elena wiped her eyes angrily. "Now I'm officially the woman that Vincent Caruso obviously cares about protecting, which means I'm valuable as leverage, which means I'm a permanent target for anyone who wants to hurt you." Vincent couldn't argue with her logic because it was sound. In his world, caring about someone was the most dangerous weakness a man could show. "I can protect you properly if you let me." "For how long exactly? A week? A month? Forever?" Elena's voice cracked. "This isn't some romantic movie, Vincent. There's no guaranteed happy ending here. There's just an endless cycle of violence and retaliation. Maybe there's no guarantee, but there's a real chance if you'll take it." He moved closer, his voice gentle. "Let me protect you. Not because you're weak or helpless, but because I genuinely can't stand the thought of you getting hurt again because of my world." Elena looked at him for what felt like an eternity, emotions warring visibly across her face. Finally, almost imperceptibly, she nodded once. "But I have non-negotiable conditions. First, I want the complete truth, always. No protecting me with comfortable lies or half information. Second, my brother Michael stays completely out of this situation. And third, I'm not your possession or trophy. We're equals, or this doesn't happen at all. Vincent smiled genuinely for the first time in days. Even broken and bandaged in a hospital bed, she was negotiating with him like she held all the cards. Equals, he agreed, carefully taking her uninjured hand. Vincent personally moved Elena to a secure safe house in Park Slope while he methodically dealt with the Castellano situation. The brownstone was comfortable but fortified, with a security system that would make a federal building jealous. Elena walked through the rooms slowly, taking in the tasteful furniture, the fully stocked kitchen, the bedroom with its peaceful view of tree-lined streets. "How long do I have to stay here?" she asked, "until the situation is completely resolved and it's genuinely safe. And when exactly will that be?" Vincent didn't answer immediately because he honestly didn't know. In his world, safety was always temporary, always conditional on circumstances beyond anyone's complete control. Meanwhile, Vincent arranged a meeting with Marco Castellano, the family patriarch. They met in the back room of a restaurant in Little Italy, neutral territory that both families respected. Marco was 58, grey-haired, and smart enough to have survived 3 brutal decades in their dangerous business. "Your younger brother Dante made a serious mistake," Vincent said without preamble. "I heard about the bookstore. He's young and impulsive." Marco's face was carefully neutral. "He attacked a civilian, an innocent woman, someone under my explicit protection." Marco's face went noticeably pale. "Vincent, I swear on my children I didn't authorize that action. Dante acted completely alone. I know he did. But he acted as a Castellano, which makes it your family's problem to solve. What exactly do you want as compensation?" Vincent laid a folder on the table between them. "I want Dante out of the business permanently, on a plane to Italy by tomorrow, and he stays there indefinitely. And I want your family to fund the complete restoration of Elena Russo's bookstore, every single penny." "That's reasonable," Marco said carefully. "What's the real price?" "Your operations in Brooklyn, the docks, the warehouses, the distribution networks. You keep everything in Jersey. Everything else comes to me." Marco's jaw visibly tightened. "That's 30% of our total revenue. It's significantly better than going to war. You know exactly what war costs. Money, men, family members." Vincent leaned forward. "I'm giving you a clear way to make this right without massive bloodshed. Take it." The older man was silent for several tense minutes, carefully weighing his limited options. Finally, he nodded slowly. "Agreed. But Vincent, you need to understand something important. Dante's not going to go quietly to Italy. He's going to think I'm weak for backing down to you. There might be serious blowback from this decision. Then handle your family properly. That's not my problem to solve." But handling Dante proved more complicated than anyone anticipated. The young Castellano, humiliated and furious, made a phone call before his forced departure. A call to someone who'd been patiently waiting 20 years for exactly this kind of opportunity. Lorenzo Rossi answered on the first ring. Vincent's father's old business partner had been presumed dead for 2 decades, killed in a power struggle in Sicily, according to all available intelligence. But Lorenzo had been very much alive, watching from the shadows, carefully planning, waiting for the perfect moment to strike back at the family that had betrayed him. Dante's call gave him that perfect moment. It started with Dante's murder in his Italian apartment 3 days after arrival. Single gunshot to the head, professional execution style. The Italian police ruled it a mob hit, probably rival families settling old scores. Marco Castellano immediately suspected Vincent, and tensions between the families escalated dangerously. Then came coordinated attacks on Caruso businesses across the city, a warehouse fire in Red Hook, a restaurant bombing in Little Italy, 3 of Vincent's collection men hospitalized with severe injuries. Someone was systematically trying to start an all-out war between the Carusos and Castellanos, while both families were focused on each other. Vincent pieced together the truth quickly through his extensive network of informants. Security footage from Dante's building, financial records traced through shell companies, witness reports from Sicily. All the evidence pointed to one impossible conclusion. Lorenzo Rossi was alive and making his move. He called another emergency meeting with Marco, this time on a yacht anchored in New York Harbor. They met on the deck with Manhattan's glittering skyline behind them, both men flanked by armed bodyguards. "Lorenzo Rossi is alive," Vincent said, handing over the compiled evidence. "He killed Dante to make you think I did it. Now he's attacking both our families while we're distracted fighting each other." Marco studied the documents carefully, his experienced eyes scanning every detail. "I thought Lorenzo died 20 years ago." "So did everyone. But he's been planning this for decades, waiting for the right opportunity. If he's making moves against both families simultaneously, he's planning to take over everything. New York, Jersey, probably the entire East Coast." Marco looked up from the papers. "We need to work together on this threat." Agreed completely. They spent 2 hours planning their coordinated response. Intelligence sharing, unified security protocols, combined resources. By the time Vincent left the yacht, he understood the scale of what was coming. Lorenzo wasn't just another ambitious rival. He was someone who knew all of Vincent's father's strategies, all the family's historical weaknesses and vulnerabilities. Fighting him would be like fighting a ghost who knew every move before you made it. Back at the brownstone, Elena was adapting to a new reality with determination. She couldn't work, couldn't return to normal life, couldn't do anything except wait in protective custody. But she refused to be passive or helpless. She started asking Vincent detailed questions about his world, how it was structured, how decisions were made, who the key players were. She read everything she could find about organized crime families, about their histories and operations. She was treating it like studying for the most important exam of her life. When Vincent visited that evening, exhausted from meetings and planning, he found her surrounded by newspapers and books, taking detailed notes. "What are you doing?" he asked. "Learning," Eleanor said simply. "If I'm going to survive in your world, I need to understand it completely. The rules, the players, the strategies, everything." Vincent sat down beside her, impressed despite his exhaustion. "Most people in your situation would be paralyzed with fear." "I am terrified," she admitted honestly, "but fear without action is just helplessness, so I'm choosing action." Over the following weeks, Vincent taught her everything: the structure of his organization, the intricate web of alliances and rivalries that shaped New York's underworld. He taught her how to read situations accurately, how to spot danger before it materialized, how to trust her instincts. Marcus taught her practical self-defense and how to handle firearms, though Vincent hated every minute of watching her learn to shoot at the range. But more importantly than the practical skills, Elena learned the crucial unwritten rules of Vincent's world. She learned that loyalty was the most valuable currency, that respect was earned exclusively through consistent actions rather than empty words, and that showing weakness could get you killed faster than anything else. She learned to read the subtle signals in tense business meetings, to understand when someone was lying through careful observation, to recognize threats before they fully materialized. And slowly, almost imperceptibly over time, she stopped being just the frightened bookstore owner and became someone fundamentally new, someone who could hold her own in Vincent's dangerous world without losing the essential core of who she was. She could be strong and even dangerous when circumstances required it, but she also held tightly onto the parts of herself that loved stories and quiet mornings and the distinct smell of old paper. The bookstore renovation was nearly complete when Lorenzo finally made his direct move. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon when Elena and Vincent were inspecting the new security features and shelving system together. The windows were still covered with protective paper, and the store was empty except for them and Marcus standing guard near the front door. The explosion came without any warning whatsoever. A massive blast that tore through the front of the building with devastating force, sending Elena flying backward into Vincent's protective arms. For several disorienting seconds, the world was nothing but choking smoke and deafening noise and falling debris raining down around them. Then Vincent was pulling her up urgently, checking her for injuries with practiced efficiency, his voice urgent and commanding in her ear. "Are you hurt anywhere?" "No, I don't think so." "Listen." Marcus was already on his phone urgently, calling for backup and medical assistance, while Vincent pulled Elena quickly toward the back exit. But before they could reach safety, 3 men in professional tactical gear burst through the smoke, military-grade weapons raised and ready. "Vincent Caruso," the lead man said, his voice mechanically distorted by his mask. "Lorenzo Rossi sends his warmest regards." Vincent immediately pushed Elena protectively behind him, his own weapon drawn in one smooth, practiced motion. "Tell Lorenzo if he wants me dead, he should come himself instead of sending hired guns to do his work." "Oh, he'll come eventually. But first he wants you to truly understand what it feels like to lose everything you value." The man's weapon shifted deliberately toward Elena, starting with her. What happened next was pure, concentrated chaos. Marcus opened fire from his position near the front, his shots dropping one of the attackers immediately. Vincent shot the leader, his bullet catching the man in the shoulder and spinning him around. The third attacker lunged directly for Elena, but she was already moving instinctively. Using the self-defense techniques Marcus had drilled into her repeatedly to dodge his grab and slam her elbow with full force into his throat. The man went down, gasping and choking, and Elena picked up his dropped weapon with trembling but determined hands. She'd never held a loaded gun outside of controlled practice at the range, but the weight felt strangely familiar now, solid and deadly in her grip. "Don't move," she commanded, her voice steadier than she felt internally. Vincent gently took the weapon from her shaking hands. "It's okay. You did extremely well." Police sirens were already wailing in the distance, growing closer, and Vincent knew they had only minutes before difficult questions started. He pulled out his phone and made a quick, coded call to his cleanup crew. The next few hours blurred together in a confusing mess of police interviews, insurance adjusters, and damage assessment. The bookstore had survived mostly intact, thanks to the reinforced structure Vincent had specifically insisted on during the renovation. But the attack had made one thing absolutely clear. Lorenzo wasn't going to stop his campaign until Vincent was either dead or completely destroyed. That night, back at the heavily fortified brownstone, Elena and Vincent sat in heavy silence, processing everything that had happened. Elena's hands had finally stopped their trembling, but she could still feel the adrenaline coursing through her veins like electricity. "You saved my life today," Vincent said quietly, breaking the silence. "That move you made, taking down that third attacker, if you hadn't reacted so quickly and decisively—" "I know what would have happened," Elena interrupted, looking at her hands. She was trying to reconcile the woman who'd efficiently dropped an armed attacker with the woman who used to spend peaceful days recommending novels to customers. "I don't know if I should feel proud or completely horrified by what I did. Feel both simultaneously. That's what I experience every single day. She looked up at him, and for the first time, she truly understood what he'd been trying to explain to her for weeks. Living in his world wasn't about making a simple choice between being good or being dangerous. It was about finding a way to be both things simultaneously, to hold on to your fundamental humanity while doing whatever needed to be done to survive. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now we end this permanently. Lorenzo's been hiding in the shadows for 20 years, but he's exposed himself by directly going after you. We'll find him and we'll finish this war." "How exactly?" Vincent pulled out his phone and showed her a series of surveillance photographs. They showed Lorenzo at various locations around the city, always heavily surrounded by professional security, always moving. Tony's people had been tracking him for days, learning his patterns, identifying his vulnerabilities. "He's staying at an old warehouse in Queens, former property that used to belong to my father. Lorenzo probably thinks he's being clever, hiding right under our noses in a place we'd never think to look." Vincent's smile was cold and predatory. "But he underestimated how well I know every single property my father ever owned." "When does this happen?" "Tomorrow night. It all ends tomorrow night." Elena wanted desperately to tell him to be careful, to make absolutely sure he came back to her safely. But she knew those were the wrong words for his world. In Vincent's reality, you didn't make promises about survival. You just did what needed to be done and hoped you lived long enough to face the consequences. "I want to come with you," she said instead, her voice firm. "Absolutely not. Vincent, if this is about us, about building our life together, then I should be there. It's precisely because it's about us that you can't be there. I need to know you're completely safe. I need to know that if something goes catastrophically wrong, you'll survive this." He took her face gently in his hands. "Elena, you've been brave enough. You've learned enough. You don't need to prove anything more to anyone." She wanted to argue further, but she could see the genuine fear beneath his determination. Not fear for himself, but profound fear for her safety. So she nodded reluctantly. "Promise me you'll come back." "I can't promise that, honestly." "Then promise me you'll try with everything you have." "I promise I'll try." They made love that night, with an intensity and urgency born of profound uncertainty, holding on to each other like they could somehow keep the dangerous world at bay through sheer force of will and desperate need. Afterward, Elena lay in Vincent's strong arms and tried to memorize absolutely everything about this perfect moment. The sound of his breathing, the warmth of his skin, the way his fingers traced gentle patterns on her shoulder. "If something happens to me tomorrow," Vincent said quietly into the darkness, "there's a safe deposit box at First National Bank. The key is in my desk drawer. Everything you need is in there. Money, documents, contacts. You'll be taken care of properly." "Oh, don't do this." "Elena, I said don't." She pulled back to look directly at his face in the dim light. "You come back to me tomorrow, Vincent Caruso. You come back and we figure out what comes next together. That's the only acceptable ending to this story." He smiled and kissed her forehead tenderly. "Yes, ma'am." The next evening, Vincent gathered his team at a warehouse in Brooklyn. 20 experienced men, all heavily armed, all absolutely loyal, all ready to end Lorenzo's threat once and for all. Marcus was there, solid and reliable as always. Tony, with his decades of invaluable experience, and a half-dozen others who'd proven themselves repeatedly over the years through loyalty and competence. "Lorenzo Rossi wants a war," Vincent told them, his voice carrying clearly. "So we're going to give him exactly that, but we're going to end it tonight decisively. No drawn-out battles, no back-and-forth retaliation cycles. We go in, we finish this permanently, and we all come home. The warehouse in Queens was dark and seemingly abandoned when they arrived, but Vincent could clearly see security cameras and armed guards positioned at strategic points around the perimeter. Lorenzo had obviously prepared extensively for an attack, but he'd prepared for a traditional frontal assault. He hadn't prepared for Vincent to know about the old drainage tunnel that connected directly to the basement, a tunnel that Vincent's father had built decades ago for exactly this kind of situation. They moved through the tunnel in complete silence, cold water dripping steadily from the ceiling, their footsteps echoing softly against concrete walls. Vincent was at the front, his weapon drawn and ready, his mind crystal clear and intensely focused. This was what he'd been trained for his entire life, not the endless paperwork or the delicate negotiations or the complex politics. This, direct action, decisive violence when absolutely necessary. They emerged into the warehouse basement and moved up the stairs in perfect tactical formation. 2 guards were stationed at the top, but Marcus and Tony took them down silently with suppressed weapons before they could raise any alarm. They cleared the ground floor systematically, room by room, methodical and professionally efficient. Lorenzo was on the 2nd floor, in what used to be Vincent's father's old private office. Vincent pushed open the door and found the old man sitting calmly behind the desk, a glass of expensive whiskey in his weathered hand, as if he'd been patiently waiting for exactly this moment. "Vincent," Lorenzo said with a cold smile, "you look remarkably like your father. It's quite remarkable, actually." "This ends tonight, Lorenzo." "Does it really? I don't think so." Lorenzo gestured casually to the window. "I have 40 well-armed men surrounding this entire building. You came with what, 20? The math really doesn't favor you." "The math has never mattered in situations like this. You should know that from experience." Vincent moved closer, his weapon trained steadily on Lorenzo's chest. "Why did you come back after 20 years? Why now?" "Because your father stole absolutely everything from me. This empire, this city, it should have been mine by right. But he pushed me out, made me look pathetically weak, forced me to run like a coward." Lorenzo's face twisted with ancient rage. "I've spent 2 decades planning this exact moment, watching you build on the foundation that should have been mine. And now I'm going to take it all back. By killing innocent people. By attacking a bookstore owner who had absolutely nothing to do with our family's history. By making you understand what profound loss feels like." Lorenzo stood up slowly. "Your father never understood that fundamental truth. He thought power was about controlling territory and accumulating money, but real power is about absolute control, about making people suffer until they completely break." "You're wrong." Vincent's voice was calm, steady. "Power is about knowing when to fight and when to walk away, about protecting what truly matters and letting go of what doesn't. Spoken like a man who's gone soft, your father would be deeply ashamed. My father was many things, but he understood loyalty. He understood family. You were never family, Lorenzo. You were just someone who desperately wanted to be." Lorenzo's face flushed with anger, and his hand moved quickly toward the desk drawer. But Vincent was faster, his training taking over. His shot caught Lorenzo in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending him crashing into the window. "It's over," Vincent said firmly. "You can die here tonight, or you can leave New York and never come back. Your choice." Lorenzo laughed bitterly, blood spreading across his white shirt. "You think you've won? You think killing me ends this? I've set things in motion that you can't possibly stop. By tomorrow, every family in New York will know you're weak. They'll know you let sentiment cloud your judgment, and they'll come for everything you have. Let them try." Vincent signaled to Marcus, who moved forward with zip ties. They secured Lorenzo and began moving him toward the stairs. But as they descended, Vincent heard the sound he'd been dreading, gunfire erupting outside the warehouse. Lorenzo's 40 men had realized what was happening and were moving in to rescue their employer. "We're trapped," Tony said grimly, checking his weapon. "We can hold them off for a while, but eventually we'll run out of ammunition and they'll overrun us," Vincent finished. He pulled out his phone and made a call he'd hoped he wouldn't have to make. "Marco, I need that favor, right now." 20 tense minutes later, Castellano reinforcements arrived, hitting Lorenzo's men from behind and catching them in a devastating crossfire. The battle was loud and brutal, but it was also decisive. By the time police sirens started wailing in the distance, Lorenzo's forces were scattered or surrendered. Vincent dragged Lorenzo outside and threw him roughly into the back of an SUV. "You're going to Sicily tonight. You're going to tell everyone there that Vincent Caruso is not weak, that he's not soft, and that anyone who comes after him or his will end up exactly like you." "And what am I?" Lorenzo spat blood. "A warning? No. You're a reminder of what happens when you forget that this business is about family, about loyalty, about protecting what truly matters." Vincent leaned in close. "Now get out of my city permanently." As the SUV drove away with Lorenzo inside, Vincent stood in the street and felt the enormous weight of what he'd done settling on his shoulders. This wasn't how these situations usually ended in his world. Usually there were bodies and blood and permanent solutions. But Vincent had chosen a different path, not because he was weak, but because Elena had shown him that strength came in many different forms. He pulled out his phone and called her. "I'm coming home. Thank God." Elena's voice was thick with tears of relief. "Are you okay?" "I'm okay. We ended it. It's over. Really over. Really over." When Vincent walked into the brownstone an hour later, Elena was waiting at the door. She threw herself into his arms, holding him so tight he could barely breathe. They stood there for a long moment, just holding each other, letting the fear and tension of the past weeks finally drain away. "What happens now?" Elena asked eventually. "Now, we rebuild everything. Your bookstore, our life, everything." Vincent pulled back to look at her face. "But first, there's something I need to ask you." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Elena's eyes went wide. "I know this is fast. I know we've barely had time to breathe, let alone think about the future, but I also know that in the past few weeks, you've become the single most important person in my life." Vincent opened the box, revealing a simple platinum band with a single perfect diamond. "I'm not asking you to marry me tomorrow. I'm asking if you'll build a life with me, if you'll stand beside me as we figure out how to exist in this world without letting it destroy us." Elena looked at the ring, then at Vincent's face, and felt tears spilling down her cheeks. "Yes," she said, "yes, I'll build a life with you." He slipped the ring onto her finger, and they kissed as the dawn broke over Brooklyn, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. It was something better, a beginning, a promise that they would face whatever came next together, as equals, as partners, as two people who'd chosen each other despite every reason not to. 6 months later, Eleanor stood in her newly renovated bookstore, surrounded by customers and friends, watching as children gathered eagerly for Saturday story time. The store was beautiful, better than it had been before, with soaring ceilings and walls lined with books and a reading corner that made the old one look shabby by comparison. But the best part wasn't the renovation, or the books, or even the success of the business. The best part was that it was truly hers. She'd made it through Vincent's world without losing herself. She'd learned to be strong and dangerous when she needed to be, but she'd also held on to the parts of herself that loved stories and quiet mornings and the smell of old paper. Vincent arrived as the story time was ending, bringing coffee from their favorite cafe and a smile that was reserved just for her. He'd stepped back from some of the more violent aspects of his business, delegating to Tony and Marcus while he focused on the legitimate enterprises that formed the backbone of his empire. They weren't perfect. Their life wasn't easy. There were still threats, still dangers, still moments when Elena remembered that she'd chosen to love a man whose world could turn violent in an instant. But there were also moments like this, quiet afternoons in her bookstore, where everything felt absolutely right. "You ready for tonight?" Vincent asked, handing her the coffee. "As ready as I'll ever be." Tonight was their engagement party, a massive affair that would bring together Vincent's world and Elena's, mixing legitimate business people with the less legitimate ones. Friends and family and associates all celebrating something that 6 months ago had seemed impossible. "Are you happy?" Vincent asked quietly. Elena looked around her bookstore, at the life she'd rebuilt from ruins, at the man who'd helped her do it, and smiled. "I'm happy," she said. "Not despite your world. Not because I've learned to tolerate it, but because I've found a way to be myself within it, and that's more than I ever hoped for." They stood together in the bookstore as the afternoon light slanted through the windows, two people who'd found each other in the most unlikely circumstances and built something real from the wreckage. It wasn't the ending Eleanor would have written 6 months ago. It was better, because it was real, messy, complicated, and absolutely undeniably theirs.